All right, class, we're going to get started with the cardiovascular system. This lecture is split into 4 different parts, which you'll see as we move through the slides. But each part may be split into smaller videos, so they are manageable to upload and download from Blackboard. So first, let's just kind of get started with what are we going to go over. First, just talking about the cardiovascular system, I would normally ask the class, what is the purpose of this system? The main purpose is delivery of blood containing oxygen. The blood also contains hormones, nutrients for all of our cells, responsible for removing metabolic products such as carbon dioxide from the cells as well, which we'll discuss more about that role in Chapter 7. We also know the cardiovascular system aids in temperature regulation, buffering of acidity, and a role in immune response. A lot of what we'll discuss as well as we move through the lecture is learning how the cardiovascular system adapts to exercise. We'll discuss acutely what happens, and then also chronically what will happen to the cardiovascular system with aerobic and anaerobic training. You can see here our chapter objectives. So what we plan to cover throughout this entire lecture, but you can kind of look at that on your own time. Make sure that you are familiar with these topics by the end of this series. So part 1, we're mainly going to talk about structure of the heart. So looking at how the heart is designed. In order to understand how the heart functions, we have to understand how the heart is first structured. So, as most of us probably know, we have 4 chambers of our heart. And we can see in the picture at the top, we have 2 atria, so also called atrium when they are singular. So 2 upper and then 2 lower, which will be ventricles. So the lower chambers are ventricles, upper chambers are the atrium. We also have valves. So our valves, we'll kind of discuss the purpose of those, but first we have 4 in total. We have 2 on the right side and 2 on the left side. I would normally ask what the purpose of our valves are. So one of the main purposes is to keep oxygenated and deoxygenated blood separate, and then to also prevent backflow, to keep blood pumping in the same direction. So the atrioventricular valves are between the upper and lower chambers. And on a picture we'll look at in the next few slides, we'll actually point those out and show you where those are. And then the 2 semilunar valves lead to arteries going to the lungs or lead to the aorta, which will deliver blood to the body. Next is the pericardium. So this is as you can read the definition, a tough membranous sac that encases the heart. So there's a space between the heart and the pericardium, and that space is filled with fluid. Normally I would ask the class, what is the purpose of that pericardial fluid, which we can see down here at the bottom? Purpose of that fluid is to prevent friction every time the heart contracts. So every time the heart contracts, beats against that wall or against that sac, we don't want the heart structures to kind of rub up against the sac. So there's a fine layer of fluid there that prevents any friction. So this slide here is to kind of point the valves out for you. So if you watch on the slide here, we see the 2 on the blue side, or the blue, I guess, colored, are talking about our right side of the heart, versus over here we have our left side of the heart. So our pulmonary valve is this structure right here, and this valve allows blood to go to the right and to the left lung. We see the tricuspid valve right down here, and that separates the upper and the lower chambers. We then look over on the other side. So on our left side, we have our bicuspid valve, which is also called the mitral valve. This separates the upper and the lower chamber. And then our aortic valve is this valve right here, and that allows blood to go into the aorta, which is then pumped to the rest of the body. So I have a video that I will pull up, and we can watch.
The heart is a pump which must circulate blood through two different but interconnected vascular systems. The smaller of these systems is the pulmonary system. Blood returning from the upper part of the body is delivered to the right atrium of the heart by the superior vena cava, one of the body's two largest veins, while blood returning from the lower part of the body is delivered to the right atrium by the other major vein, the inferior vena cava. Contraction of the right atrium in each cardiac cycle forces blood into the right ventricle. This is followed by contraction of the right ventricle, which pumps blood into the pulmonary artery, sending it on through the blood vessels of the lungs. As the right ventricle contracts and pressure within the right ventricle rises, the tricuspid valve situated at the opening between the right atrium and right ventricle shuts, preventing any backflow. The pressure generated by contraction of the right ventricle soon opens the pulmonary valve and blood enters the circulation of the lungs. After passing through the circulation of the lungs, the blood, having been recharged with oxygen and having rid itself of carbon dioxide, is returned through the pulmonary veins to the left atrium. The left atrium, too, contracts, forwarding blood into the left ventricle in order to fill it before it contracts. As the powerful left ventricle contracts, the mitral valve shuts, preventing backflow into the left atrium. The aortic valve opens and blood is forced into the aorta, which distributes it to the rest of the body apart from the lungs.
So, continuing, let's now kind of break down the arteries versus the veins. So anytime you think of artery, I have this word right here, away. So is blood always moving away from the heart? It can be moving away to the lungs or away to the body. So either way, those are arteries. The arteries are delivering that blood. Let's go down smaller. We have arterioles. So arterioles are just small branches of the arteries. And then one further is capillaries. These are the smallest vessel, and this is the only site of gas exchange between oxygen and carbon dioxide. And we'll discuss gas exchange during chapter 7, but just know capillaries is where this takes place. Looking at the arteries, again, these arteries can handle really high blood pressures. They have very strong muscular walls that rapidly transport blood pumping from the heart. So they can handle really high pressures. So all of these are moving away. Capillaries, this is where the blood will gather, and we can see in this picture at the bottom, let's say a muscle, for instance. Our muscles are embedded with capillaries, so our capillary beds. Interesting fact about our capillaries is each cell in all of our tissues must be at least 0.1 millimeters of the nearest capillary. This is so gas exchange can take place. Capillaries are the most numerous. They have the most branches, which allows for more total vessel cross-sectional area from blood to travel. So when we look at oxygenated versus deoxygenated, if we're moving from the heart to the body, we have oxygen. We are oxygenated blood. But let's talk about veins. So with veins, these are large vessels that are carrying blood back toward the heart. There's a word I'll use a lot in this lecture called venous return. So venous return is anytime we have blood returning to the heart. We have venules, which are small veins. They collect blood from the capillary. And we see that in this picture at the bottom. We have our capillary bed. And then after the capillaries, or basically the blood has dropped off all of its oxygen, it becomes deoxygenated. And so that deoxygenated blood is also high in carbon dioxide, which was produced in the muscle, and we learned about that in chapter 3. So this carbon dioxide then is diffused into the capillaries where the blood is, and that's where we have venous return. So now this blood being pumped back to the heart is lacking oxygen, but it's high in carbon dioxide. That's where the lungs come in, because that's where we're going to exhale and get rid of all of that CO2 that our body produced. So this next slide here, this looks at pulmonary versus peripheral. So there are different ways we can describe blood. We can describe blood as pulmonary, meaning it involves the lungs. But it can be from the heart to the lungs, or from the lungs back to the heart. So if the lungs are involved, we are pulmonary. And so this picture down here at the bottom looks at pulmonary circulation. So we have our heart. We have the blue is our deoxygenated blood. So this was delivered into the heart and now passed to the lungs to become oxygenated. This process will be discussed in chapter 7. And then we have oxygenated blood coming back into the left side of the heart. Eventually, it's going to be pumped out of the aorta, which leads to the body. So that gets us to peripheral, which is this picture over here. And peripheral describes anything dealing with the body. So with the body, we're basically looking at the blood that's oxygen rich traveling to the body. So that would be arterial blood moving away from the heart. We also have venous peripheral blood. So this means venous return. It's blood flowing back to the heart that's deoxygenated. It still involves the body, so that's still referring to peripheral. So we already discussed arteries versus veins. We can also describe blood as arterial blood or venous blood. Arterial blood we see is leaving in arteries, so either going to the body or to the lungs. So arterial blood is deoxygenated in pulmonary circulation because it's going away from the heart to the lungs to become oxygenated, and then it's oxygenated in peripheral because if it's arterial, it's moving away from the heart to the body, delivering oxygen. Venous blood is the opposite. So venous blood is blood returning to the heart. So it's deoxygenated in peripheral. So venous return, it's lacking oxygen, but it's high in CO2. And then it's oxygenated in pulmonary. So pulmonary blood, in this picture, this red picture down here, when it's returning to the heart, it has lots of oxygen because that's going to be passed off to the body. So what's neat about our body is we have a parallel arrangement of vasculature. So what does this mean? Parallel circuitry basically just allows for blood to get to a certain organ or a muscle without having to pass through any other organ or tissue first. So it can get straight to that organ. If it had to pass through other organs, other tissues, muscles, it would lose oxygen on its way there. But to prevent the loss of oxygen, our body has this parallel arrangement where we have direct delivery of blood to a certain area or region. And another reason we have this parallel circuitry is to keep oxygenated blood returning to the heart from pulmonary circulation and to keep deoxygenated blood returning to the heart from peripheral circulation. So keeping them separate from each other. So the next few slides will go into the actual blood flow path through the heart. So first, let's define what does a pulmonary circuit mean. So it basically just has to do, we already said, with the lungs. So arteries carry blood low in oxygen to the lungs for gas exchange. We have to become oxygenated. So we are basically dropping off our CO2 and receiving oxygen from the lungs. So anytime we are looking at the right side of the heart, so right atrium, right ventricle, that blood just came from the body. It's deoxygenated. So it's going to pass through the pulmonary arteries, which will end up in the lungs. This is where gas exchange takes place. And then after that blood has become oxygenated, it'll pass back through the pulmonary veins to the heart, and it will drop right into the left atrium. So all of that was just described, that's the pulmonary circuit. The peripheral, also referred to as systemic circuit, is now involving the body. So it's making sure that the body is receiving oxygen-rich blood. So what involves here? We see the left atrium is kind of where we left off, but then also again where we start. So left atrium just received blood from the lungs. Purpose of the left side of the body is to send that blood to the aorta, which goes to the body. So here we go. We go left atrium, which passed through a valve, ends up in the left ventricle. The left ventricle will lead to another valve, which will allow that blood to be pumped into the aorta. Aorta will then pump the blood through the body. That's where we get to the arteries, the arterioles, the capillaries, venules, veins. So now we're returning back to the heart. The capillaries is where all that blood got dropped off in. And now we're returning back to the heart, so venous return. Now the blood is deoxygenated, and we enter into the vena cava. We'll look on the next slide how we have a superior and an inferior vena cava, which will then drop that blood back into the right atrium. And you see the right atrium, where we leave off here, is where the permanent pulmonary circuit starts all over again. So here we go. As I go through this, obviously you can pause this video on your own time, review it as many times as you want to learn this process. So this process is necessary to understand. So let's first start at the top. So superior vena cava at the top here, and then inferior vena cava at the bottom. So superior vena cava is blood from the upper body, so the upper body, and the head, and the neck. And then the inferior vena cava is blood that came from our trunk, our torso, and our lower extremities. So blood is returning from the body. It's deoxygenated because it just dropped all of its oxygen. And then it passes into the right atrium. We see the arrows right here. The right atrium will then lead to the tricuspid valve, which separates these two chambers. So it passes into this valve right here. Now we're in the right ventricle. The right ventricle is a chamber that leads to, and we're up here, the pulmonary semilunar valve. Pulmonary, meaning now we're going to the lungs. So we follow these two arrows here. We have a right pulmonary artery and a left pulmonary artery. They both go to the lungs, right side of the lungs, or right lung or left lung. And then that's where we become oxygenated. Gas exchange takes place. And now we are returning back to the heart. So right pulmonary vein, left pulmonary vein. We can see those right there. And we enter into the left atrium, which leads to a valve called the bicuspid, also called the mitral valve, which goes down to the left ventricle. The left ventricle is our largest and strongest chamber, even though it doesn't look like that in this picture, it is. So largest, strongest chamber, which then will pump blood forcefully up through, left atrium, here we are, aortic semilunar valve, which is right there, and it passes up into this large structure right here, which is our aorta. So the aorta, then we have a descending and then an ascending aorta, and that will pass blood to our entire body. You can see here we have red is oxygenated, blue is deoxygenated, just so you can keep it separate. So that's one way to learn the blood flow through the heart. Another way is just to learn it by these words right here, or these statements. So starting again, blood returns to the heart from the body. We're in peripheral. So RA, everything's abbreviated here. We have right atrium from the vena cava. Then that atrium is going to contract and it's going to pump blood through our one-way tricuspid valve on the right side into the right ventricle. Then it's pumped through the pulmonary semilunar valve into the lungs, basically. So passing to the lungs, the pulmonary arteries, it becomes oxygenated. Now it has to return back to the heart. It's going to return back to the heart through the pulmonary veins and drop right into the left atria. It will then pass through the bicuspid valve and drop into the left ventricle, which will then be pumped through the aortic semilunar valve into the aorta, which is passed through the entire body, so we have oxygen. Here is a video that will show this.
How the blood flows in the heart. Beating on average 70 times per minute, each day the heart beats about 100,000 times. In the course of a 70-year lifetime, it will beat more than 2.5 billion times without ever pausing to rest. The cycle of blood flow is as follows. The right atrium receives blood from the great veins, the superior and inferior vena cava. Blood passes from the right atrium through the tricuspid valve to the right ventricle. From the right ventricle, blood is pumped through the pulmonary valve and pulmonary arteries to the lungs. In the lungs, carbon dioxide is removed from the blood and oxygen is picked up. Through the pulmonary veins, oxygenated blood returns to the left atrium. From the left atrium, blood passes through the mitral valve to the left ventricle. As the left ventricle contracts, the pressure closes the mitral valve. The aortic valve opens, allowing blood to leave the heart via the main blood vessel called the aorta. When the cycle of pumping is complete, the aortic valve closes to prevent blood from dropping back into the heart. The heart is two separate pumps that work together. Oxygenated and nutrient-rich blood is pumped around the body. Deoxygenated blood, which contains waste products, is returned to the lungs to allow the entire cycle to begin again.
Alright, so you can now see blood flow through the heart. This page here is basically for y'all to look at first what a real beating heart looks like, and second, to try to label each one of these structures. You also have this on a handout along with this slide here. So you have a handout on Blackboard if you go to, I think, handouts in the handouts folder, and you can go to chapter 6 and you can try to label this. So this will be important to know blood flow through the heart and how to label. Last, normally what we would do is the class would get together and they would answer these questions. So what these is basically I give you a statement and you're having to figure out, we have A, pulmonary, peripheral, venous, arterial, oxygenated, or deoxygenated. So normally I would let you figure this out. So what would be helpful is if you pause my video and try to answer it yourself. So answer it yourself, try to figure out what number 1, 2, and 3 are, because right now I'm about to give you those answers. But for you to learn it, you need to practice by yourself. So first, blood entering into the superior and inferior vena cava. So this is kind of tricky, pulmonary or peripheral, because it just came from the body. It is about to go to the lungs, but since it just came from the body, it's going to be peripheral. We then have B, venous or arterial. So with this one, venous return. It's the blood just returned back to the heart. Oxygenated or deoxygenated. It is deoxygenated because we just dropped off all of the oxygen to our body. So that's number 1, peripheral, venous, deoxygenated. Number 2, now the blood is being pumped back out of the aorta. So this is peripheral because it's going to the body. Arterial because it's moving away from the heart. And then it's oxygenated because we are trying to give our body the oxygen it needs. So peripheral, arterial, oxygenated. And then for 3, blood returning to the heart, but now coming from the lungs. So this is pulmonary because it involves the lungs. It's also venous because it's moving away, away from the lungs to the heart. And then it's oxygenated because we just went through gas exchange. So that is part 1, or I guess half of part 1. It's a long video, it's like 23 minutes, so I hope it uploads and downloads to